The last question on the practice SAC was all about the budget variance report. And what we've been given is we're told that Diane Easton owns a small business selling a range of dresses and clothing. The firm's annual reporting period ends on the 30th of June each year. In reviewing the firm's activities for the year ended 30th of June 2022 against the budget, the accountant prepared an income statement variance report. An incomplete extract from this report is shown below. And in your answer booklet, there it was. So, you had to do a few things. The first thing you had to do was for A, complete the income statement variance report extract. Just remember, extract means just a part of it. It's not all of it. And to do that, you need to remember that there's favorable variances and unfavorable variances. And the biggest mistake you can do here is go to favorable means more than, unfavorable means less than. That is not true. What it means is favorable. The actual result was better than. In other words, better than the budgeted result. In other words, we performed better than we expected to. And that means unfavorable, the actual result was worse than the budgeted result. In other words, we performed worse than we expected to. And the reason why it's not more than or less than is because for some things you actually want them to be less than you budgeted. So let's have a look and see if we can demonstrate. So we've got sales here. We budgeted or expected to do 490,000. We actually only did 470, so the variance is 20,000. Now, so if you put that as a negative 20, as in it was $20,000 less than budgeted, that's okay. That's not important. What's important is you get this letter right here. And you write U for unfavorable because the sales were worse than we expected to achieve. We expected 490, we only did 470. Now, this is one where, so sales are a revenue, so you want them to be more than. So favorable means more than in that case. But for cost of sales, we budgeted for 300,000, yet it was actually more than that. So what does that mean? Well, in that case, that is actually a variance of 40,000, and that is unfavorable. It's more than, but more than for an expense is actually worse. So that is worse than we hope to achieve. So therefore, our gross profit, we budgeted for 190, it was only 160. So therefore, there was a variance of 30,000, and again, that's unfavorable. So it was $30,000 less than we'd hoped, so that is worse than we expected it to be, so that's unfavorable. The rent they've done for us, we're going to come back to that for a later question. And then this time, they've just asked a little bit differently. Advertising was 30,000, that's what we budgeted for. What was it actually though? Now in this case, we need to be able to interpret a favorable variance. So advertising is an expense. So if it was better than we'd hoped, that would mean we'd spent less. So in this case, 25,000. So we budgeted to spend 30 on advertising. We actually only spent 25. That's a variance of 5, so therefore that's favorable. So with the marking, we just obviously went 1 mark, there's 4 marks, or 1 mark for each completed line. That brings us to B, referring to the extract above. State whether the rent is a revenue or an expense. So they filled this one in for us. So we budgeted for 3,000. We actually achieved 3,200. That's a variance of, just to say 200, not 2,000. And it's favorable. All right, so we need to interpret that. That means the actual result was better than the budgeted result. So that must mean, in this case, rent is actually a revenue. Because if it was, if we actually spent more on rent as an expense than we budgeted, this would be unfavorable. That's bad. But in this case, rent can actually be a revenue. We have a property and we rent it out to someone. So this actually makes sense. We expected to make $3,000 of rent in revenue. We made $3,200. That's a variance of 200, not 2,000. So therefore, that is favorable. So that is a better result than we'd hoped. So how do we've got 2 marks here. Obviously 1 mark for saying here, this is a revenue. That's what we need to write. And just explain why. And it's because the actual amount is greater than the budgeted amount, and that variance is favorable. So this must mean the rent was revenue or a cash inflow. You probably don't need this third line here. It's just probably these 2 points there. Okay, C, explain 2 reasons why actual cost of sales was more than budgeted during the year. So I've got cost of sales there with the completed version. I've also included sales because I don't think you can talk about this question unless you look at sales. So one reason, so let's have a look at cost of sales. We thought cost of sales, which is an expense, we thought it would be 300,000, and it's actually 340,000. That's unfavorable by 40,000. So generally what could happen is maybe the cost of sales was worse because we increased our sales. But you can actually, or sales were more than we budgeted, but actually sales were worse than we'd expected. So that does not explain it. So we're going to have to come up with two other reasons. So that is actually quite tricky. So I guess one reason could be, we could say maybe this increased because suppliers increased their prices and that increased the cost of sales expense. That's a good answer. But then you'd probably think if suppliers increase the price, wouldn't we as a business increase our prices, and therefore wouldn't sales be more than budgeted? So we'd better say this increase in prices from suppliers was not passed on to customers in the form of higher sales prices, because otherwise this probably would have been here and actually much more than budgeted. So that's one explanation. We could also say that maybe the business lowered the markup of inventory, and on its own that's a very good answer. We lowered the markup, but then if we lowered them up, we sold the exact same number of units we thought, but we just sold them cheaper, then cost of sales would have been the same price, because the budget would have been the actual, because we sold exactly as many as we expected, and the cost price would have been what we planned for it to be. So we better sell here. All right, so we lowered the price of inventory and we sold more units. That would explain why this was actually more than budgeted, so we sold more units, so cost of sales is more than we budgeted, yet because we sold each one much cheaper than we expected, the sales result was actually unfavorable. It was actually less than budgeted for. So that's a really tough question. Just a couple of notes. Another valid response could be, instead of putting, this first sentence here, suppliers have increased their prices, you could have said either the cost of cartage inwards, buying expenses, or customs duty. So they're your other cost of sales, but their cost of goods sold. That's not actually cost of sales, but what you could say is you could go, these could be logically allocated to each unit. And if you remember, this is a really advanced A+ answer, but it just means that when you do logically allocate these, it's called a product cost, and therefore it's part of the cost of sales. That would explain it. That's a brutal answer. That's A+. That's probably not as obvious as these two, but if you did get that, that's actually really clever. And just one thing to note, you can't say we increased sales. Cost of sales was higher because we increased sales by increasing the number of units sold. So we can say that here after we've said we sold them at a lower price than expected, but we can't just say that on its own. We can't just say we increased the number of units sold, because that does not explain this number here. So we would need to say we increased the number of units sold, but we sold them for much less than we budgeted for. And our final question was explain the impact of the variance in advertising on the business during the year using the information provided. So that's where you've got to be able to interpret these as well. So try and make the parts talk to each other. So we can see here advertising was a favorable result because we spent less on advertising than we budgeted. But that's why this column can be misleading, because maybe you should have spent more on advertising. Now, if you did, maybe your sales would have actually been higher than you budgeted for. And therefore, maybe there's a link. Even though this says favorable, it doesn't mean good. It just means better than, or in this case, because it's an expense and it was lower than we planned, we said that's favorable, true, and that's our mathematical definition, I guess. But sometimes spending less on an expense can result in an unfavorable result somewhere else, and that's what we've got here. So I'm going to say the advertising expense was less than budgeted, and what that means is we incurred less on advertising than we planned. Okay, but now we've got to say what's the impact of that? Well, I'm going to say the impact for me is evident here in this sales. This could explain why sales were lower than expected, as it's reasonable to assume that advertising leads to sales. So therefore, if we spent less on sales, or if we incurred less on advertising, it would make sense that we achieved lower sales. So that's a great example. This is a very simple variance report. Usually you could get more info. And it's important that you can make the parts talk to each other. Try and see why one figure might explain another figure.